The funeral was silent until a single, thunderous bark shattered the stillness, and every head turned toward the coffin. What did the loyal K9 sense that no one else could? Here's what happened. But before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. The bitter chill of dawn seemed to seep into every bone as the mourners gathered, their breaths visible in the cold air like fading ghosts of memories, too painful to hold. Rows of soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces carved from stone, eyes forward but minds adrift in the echoes of missions past and battles survived under Colonel Devereaux's command. Mothers clutched folded flags to their chests, the embroidered stars pressed against trembling lips as silent prayers slipped through quivering breaths. The sharp gleam of metals caught the pale morning light, each one a silent testimony to sacrifices that could never be undone. And there, unwavering amidst the ocean of grief, stood Valor, his powerful frame motionless, his head held high, but eyes dark with a sorrow too deep for words. He had been more than a soldier's companion. He had been a guardian of lives, a silent witness to bravery and horror alike. And now, in this final moment, he stood as a lone sentinel over his master's final journey. The chaplain's voice broke through the silence, low and solemn, reciting passages meant to soothe shattered hearts. But the words seemed to drift away on the wind, lost in the overwhelming presence of that flag-draped coffin. As the ceremonial rifles gleamed coldly at the ready, a heavy tension hung between every heartbeat, a tension that pressed against ribs and squeezed throats tight with the weight of impending finality. Valor's ears twitched, ever alert, as if even now he stood ready to protect his master from unseen threats, his loyalty refusing to yield to the cruel reality of death. His tail remained still, his breathing measured and deep, every inch of him a monument to discipline and devotion. The old veterans in attendance exchanged glances, their weathered faces reflecting memories of their own fallen brothers, the weight of years and regrets settling heavier on their shoulders. And yet, despite the rigid precision of the ceremony, all eyes kept drifting back to Valor, drawn not just by his presence but by the haunting question that seemed to hang in the air. What did he sense in this moment that no human could? The wind whispered through the marble gravestones like a forgotten hymn, rustling the neatly pressed uniforms and tugging at the hem of the great American flag draped over the casket. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop as the flag lifted ever so slightly, revealing a glimpse of the smooth, polished oak beneath, and Valor's body tensed as though an invisible thread had just pulled taut across his soul. Captain Elaine Mercer, standing at the front of the formation, felt the hair rise at the back of her neck as she caught the faintest glimmers of something unspoken passing between the fallen colonel and his steadfast companion. The hush deepened, breaths held tighter, and in that moment, every heart present seemed to beat not for the living, but for the final command unspoken and the bond that refused to break, even in death. The chaplain's voice carried over the hollow stillness like a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point, words meant to comfort falling flat against the heavy weight of grief that hung over the gathered souls. Valor stood unmoving, a stone-carved sentinel at the foot of the casket, his powerful shoulders squared, his stance unwavering, his breath slow and deliberate as if every inhale was a conscious act of defiance against the overwhelming sorrow pressing in around him. His deep amber eyes, locked with unwavering focus on the coffin, seemed to flicker with memories no living soul could fully understand. Memories of nights spent under foreign skies, where mortar fire lit the horizon, and the only promise of survival came through whispered commands and the unspoken bond between man and dog. The soldiers who stood among the mourners had witnessed that bond firsthand, had seen Marcus Devereaux drop to his knees in the midst of chaos to shield Valor from incoming shrapnel, had heard the desperate calls through the radio when Valor went missing behind enemy lines only to return days later, bloodied but unbowed, guiding lost men back to safety. That kind of loyalty wasn't bred. It was forged in the crucible of fear, sacrifice, and the kind of love that could only be born when life and death shared the same breath. And now, as the cold wind swept through the cemetery, rustling through the gravestones like the restless whispers of the fallen, Valor stood alone against it all, a living monument to promises made and kept long after the final command had been given. Mothers clutched their folded flags tighter, their eyes drawn to him as if his silent vigil offered them some small piece of understanding in a world that made none, while battle-hardened men, their eyes lined with the weight of memories too painful to speak, swallowed hard against the tightness in their throats. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment, and in that suffocating stillness, the faintest movement became a thunderclap. Valor's ears twitched, just once, a flicker of recognition, and those gathered swore they saw his eyes glisten with a sorrow far deeper than instinct, a sorrow that seemed almost human. Captain Elaine Mercer, standing just behind the casket, felt her chest tighten as she watched him, her mind racing back to the missions where Marcus and Valor had stood side by side, where Valor had dragged wounded soldiers from burning wreckage, where he had stood in front of Marcus with teeth bared against enemies twice his size and yet never backed down. She had thought she'd seen everything war could do to a soul, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of this proud creature standing in perfect silence, every muscle taut, as if waiting for his master's voice to call him home one final time. And as the chaplain's words faded into the wind, that terrible, expectant silence settled over the field like a final curtain, leaving every heart caught between the weight of sorrow and the haunting realization that some bonds refuse to break, even when separated by the cold hand of death. The chaplain's voice quivered as he spoke of bravery, sacrifice, and a life lived in unwavering service. But before the final words could settle, the heavens seemed to stir with a restless breath, and a sudden gust of wind swept mercilessly through the cemetery, rattling the rows of rigid soldiers and pulling at the hem of the great flag draped over Marcus's coffin. For a fleeting moment, that proud banner lifted just enough to expose the gleaming, polished oak beneath, a glimmer of finality that seemed almost too much for the living to bear. And then, in that suspended second, Valor moved. His massive paw slid forward, claws scraping against the weathered stone path with a sharpness that rang out through the silent gathering like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Heads turned instinctively toward him, eyes wide with confusion, some with a dawning sense of dread, as if the world itself had tilted slightly out of balance. Captain Elaine Mercer, standing just beyond the coffin, felt the chill of that sound run down her spine like icy fingers trailing over exposed skin, her breath catching as she turned to witness what her heart had already suspected. This wasn't just grief playing tricks on them. Something unseen was unfolding before their very eyes. Valor's head tilted with haunting precision, his ears perked to full alert, his body coiled with a tension that could not be explained away by the solemnity of the occasion, his amber eyes burning with a depth of understanding that defied logic, remained locked on the casket as if drawn there by a bond that refused to fade with the closing of a coffin lid. The mourners held their breath, the air charged with a strange, electric stillness, the wind circling as though the spirits of the fallen themselves were bearing witness to what no living soul could yet understand. In that moment, time seemed to stretch thin, the weight of past missions and unsaid goodbyes hanging like an invisible veil over the gathering. Valor took another slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never wavering, his movements measured as if he were responding to a command that only he could hear. Captain Mercer's pulse thudded painfully in her ears, her mind flashing back to the long-forgotten nights crouched beside Marcus and Valor behind enemy lines, where whispers carried more weight than shouts and every command had the power to save or doom a life. She remembered the promise Marcus had made, a vow spoken with a solemnity she hadn't understood until now. When the time comes, he'll know. Trust him, Mercer. Even when I'm gone, he'll know. And here, beneath the sullen gray sky, with the wind pulling at the veil between the living and the lost, it seemed that time had come. Valor's steady gaze never broke, his breath slow but resolute. And in that charged silence, every person present felt the same shiver of recognition. Something was unfinished. Some final duty remained. And it rested not in the hands of the living, but in the heart of a loyal companion who had never failed his master and would not fail him now. The air hung thick and motionless, the final echoes of the chaplain's trembling voice fading into the overcast sky when, without warning, Valor's powerful chest expanded, And from deep within him erupted a bark so raw, so commanding, that it split the silence with the force of a battlefield explosion. The sound reverberated across the marble headstones, crashing against the gathered. Mourners like a wave of unseen energy, raw and undeniable. Gasps broke through the crowd as some stepped back instinctively, their eyes wide with disbelief, while others stood frozen in place, their hearts thudding painfully in their chests, as though the very earth beneath them had shifted. Captain Elaine Mercer felt her own pulse slam against her ribs, her gaze locked on the towering figure of Valor, who now sat fully upright, his massive frame poised and statuesque, his broad chest heaving with the aftermath of that singular, haunting crime. His eyes, dark and bottomless, burned not with the innocent confusion of an animal out of place, but with something far older, something forged in the fire of loyalty and purpose, something that spoke of unfinished oaths and promises etched into his very soul. The chaplain faltered, his lips parting mid-verse, but no words followed, his hands trembling as the Bible in his grip dipped low under the crushing weight of that defiant sound. Valor had stood at more ceremonies than anyone could count, a silent figure of strength and discipline, always the unwavering sentinel during the hardest of goodbyes, never once uttering a sound in defiance of the rigid traditions that governed these sacred moments. But today, something had shattered that unbreakable silence. And in that instant, every soldier present knew it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't the confused cry of a grieving animal. It was a message, clear and deliberate, forged from a bond that had transcended even death. The flag atop the coffin rippled faintly in the restless breeze, and Valor's ears twitched once more as if tuning into a frequency lost to the living, a silent command issued from beyond the grave. Captain Mercer felt her throat tighten painfully, a lump of grief and dawning realization rising so fast she could hardly breathe, her mind racing back to the countless nights huddled with Marcus and Valor, the whispered words of trust and loyalty exchanged between man and dog under the shroud of combat's darkest hours. Valor's eyes shifted slightly, scanning the faces before him, his gaze resting on each soldier in turn, as if seeking the one who would understand, the one who could bear witness to what must come next. And then, just as the tension seemed ready to break the sky itself, Valor's head turned back to the coffin, his body coiling not in grief but in readiness, as though he stood at the precipice of fulfilling one final order, an unspoken command passed in the last breath of a dying hero. The mourners stood captive to the moment, their hearts pounding in unison with the relentless certainty that this was no ordinary funeral. This was the beginning of something none of them could yet comprehend, a reckoning called forth by a loyal heart that refused to let its master's final mission be buried with him. The very air seemed to crackle, charged with an unseen force that pressed against every chest and tightened every breath, as if the cemetery itself had become a battlefield, cloaked not in smoke and fire, but in the suffocating weight of the unknown. It was a sensation every soldier recognized. The pause before Cade, the trembling moment when instinct screamed that something was about to break through the veil of calm with the violence of a hidden storm. Captain Mercer felt her fists clench involuntarily at her sides, the phantom weight of a rifle she no longer carried, suddenly tangible against her palms, her mind unwillingly dragged back to the blinding sandstorms and the nights lit by tracer fire, where Marcus and Valor stood at the heart of every storm. She could almost hear Marcus's voice through the howl of distant winds, low and firm, commanding with a calm that could steady a man on the brink of fear. Protect, stay true, remember. Those words, spoken so often in the face of death, had seemed like nothing more than ritual at the time, a mantra to hold the line against despair. But here, under this gray and mournful sky, they echoed with new meaning, as if Marcus had poured his final will into them, binding Valor to a promise that had yet to be fulfilled. And before anyone could gather their thoughts or breathe through the tension that squeezed the air to breaking, Valor's voice thundered once more, a second bark, sharper, louder, undeniable, bursting from his chest with such force it seemed to cut straight through the polished oak of the coffin and tear at the hearts of everyone present. The sound didn't simply ring through the air, it seemed to vibrate within the marrow of their bones, a primal commanding cry that demanded attention and defied anyone to ignore its purpose. Heads snapped toward the coffin, the flag rippling in the unsettled wind like a living thing. Valor stood tall now, his tail lowered but firm, his chest heaving with slow, deliberate breaths as if he were counting down to a moment only he could sense. Captain Mercer's eyes locked on him, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the rustling leaves or the whispered gasps of the mourners. In Valor's eyes burned something more than loyalty, something more than grief. It was the fire of duty left undone, of a soldier who understood that the final mission had not ended with the last breath of his master. And as if guided by that invisible tether to Marcus's final command, Valor took a step forward, his powerful paws moving with the certainty of a soldier following a long-awaited order. Mercer's breath caught as she suddenly remembered that last night in the desert, Marcus pulling her aside with urgency in his tired eyes. If anything happens to me, Valor knows what to do. Trust him. He'll find the truth. The words hit her now with the weight of revelation, every syllable clicking into place like the final sequence of a long-forgotten code. And as Valor advanced toward the coffin with the solemn grace of a warrior answering his final call, every person present knew without a shred of doubt that this was no ordinary farewell. It was the beginning of the truth finally clawing its way into the light. The shift in the air was almost physical, a heavy presence settling over the gathering like a curtain drawn tight around a stage no one dared step onto. Every breath seemed suspended, every heart beating in cautious unison, as if the entire world had narrowed to the gleaming oak coffin that now seemed to pulse with its own gravity, drawing every eye, every ounce of awareness into its silent, waiting presence. The polished surface glinted faintly beneath the restless sway of trembling leaves above, each reflection a flickering echo of the life and legacy sealed inside. Valor stood perfectly still at the coffin's side, his powerful frame angled toward the resting place of his fallen master, his tail lowered but unmoving, his ears tilted forward, tuned to something no one else could hear. His eyes, dark and gleaming, held a focus so sharp it seemed to cut through the veil between life and death, locking onto that casket as if through it he could still feel the familiar presence of the man he had followed through storms of lead and fire. Captain Mercer felt her feet move before her mind could catch up, drawn forward by the invisible current of this impossible moment. Her throat dry as desert sand, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum heralding a battle yet to come. She watched as Valor stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate, the soft pad of his paws against the cold stone path, the only sound breaking through the thick wall of silence. It was not a walk, but a procession, a ritual older than words, a solemn march of duty and remembrance that required no human guidance. And then, with a grace that brought tears unbidden to the eyes of battle-hardened men and grieving mothers alike, Valor pressed his powerful snout against the flag-draped wood, his breath huffing out in a low, trembling whine that cut deeper than any eulogy ever could. The sound seemed to vibrate through the air, a mournful note of loss and longing that carried within it every battle cry, every quiet night under foreign skies, every moment of loyalty that had passed between man and dog without the need for language. Captain Mercer felt her vision blur, the weight of memory crashing down upon her shoulders with a force she could barely stand beneath. She could almost see Marcus kneeling beside Valor in some distant corner of the world, his hand resting gently on the dog's broad head, whispering promises into the night that not even death could silence. The mourners stood locked in place, unable to look away, their grief merging with a collective understanding that this was not the end of a story. It was the lingering echo of a vow left unfinished. And as Valor lifted his head, his eyes glistening but unbroken, the wind seemed to hush, the earth itself holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Because in that single haunting moment, everyone present understood that the coffin might have held Marcus Devereaux's body, but his final command still walked among them on four steadfast paws. Captain Mercer's breath hitched as her gloved fingers brushed against the smooth underside of the casket, her heart pounding in her ears louder than the shifting winds that stirred the edges of the flag above. Her fingertips moved methodically despite the trembling that threatened to betray the steel composure she had worn for years. And then, with a soft click barely audible beneath the breathless silence, she found it. a seam so precise it was almost invisible to the naked eye. She pressed gently, and a hidden panel slid open with the slow reluctance of a secret kept far too long. Her pulse roared in her head as she reached into the dark hollow, her fingers curling around the brittle edges of an envelope so aged it felt like it might crumble at her touch. When she drew it into the open light, the mourners gasped in unison. A collective breath exhaled in disbelief as their eyes fell on the single line scrawled across the front of the faded paper in Marcus's unmistakable hand. Final command. Her throat tightened against the weight of unspoken promises and forgotten vows as she carefully broke the wax seal, the crack of it unnaturally loud in the expectant stillness. The letter unfolded slowly, the paper delicate and worn thin in places, the ink smudged by time and perhaps tears, but the words remained clear, a final testament from a man who had prepared for this moment long before his final breath. Captain Mercer's eyes moved quickly over the page, her vision swimming as the meaning of Marcus's last words took hold. This wasn't a farewell or a final confession. This was a mission, unfinished, unresolved, and more dangerous than anything they had faced together on foreign soil. It spoke of betrayal buried deep within their own ranks, a covert operation compromised by someone trusted, someone still hidden among them. Marcus had gathered proof, names, and locations, but the risk of exposure had been too great to share it openly. Instead, he entrusted the truth to the only ones he believed could carry it forward, those who stood here now, and the one loyal soul who had never failed him. Valor. Mercer swallowed hard against the lump rising in her throat, her gaze lifting from the fragile letter to find Valor standing motionless before her, his eyes locked on hers with a steady, knowing intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. It was as if he had waited for this exact moment, as if every fiber of his being had been holding back until this final piece fell into place. Around them, the mourners stood frozen, their sorrow now mingling with something sharper, more urgent, a burning need to finish what their fallen leader had started. Captain Mercer rose slowly to her feet, the letter clutched against her chest, her voice breaking the oppressive silence with a steady resolve that cut through the grief like a blade through fog. "We have our orders," she said, her eyes never leaving Valor's. And in that moment, with the final command in her hand and Valor standing at her side, the funeral became something else entirely. A gathering not to mourn the dead, but to honor him with action, to see his final mission completed no matter the cost. Captain Mercer's hands trembled as she held the fragile letter against the cold air, her eyes scanning every word like they were the last pieces of Marcus's living soul reaching out from beyond the grave. The ink, though faded and smudged by time, and perhaps the trembling hands that had written it, carved its way into her heart with ruthless precision. Each line was a confession and a call to arms, the burden of a truth Marcus had carried alone to his final breath. His words painted a picture of a mission so dangerous it had never been entered into official records. A covert operation buried beneath layers of false reports and classified files. An operation meant to dismantle a smuggling network that had infiltrated their own ranks, costing innocent lives under the guise of failed missions and unavoidable tragedies. But it hadn't been failure, it had been betrayal. Marcus had uncovered the faces behind the treachery, men who had worn the same uniforms, stood under the same flag, and yet sold their loyalty for blood money and political gain. He had gathered the evidence, but when the noose began to tighten around his own neck and threats crept closer to those he swore to protect, he had hidden the final pieces away, locking them beyond reach and placing the last key in the care of the one companion he trusted beyond all others. Valor. Captain Mercer's breath caught as she read the final lines aloud, her voice breaking under the weight of them, the gathered mourners hanging on every syllable like the air itself depended on what came next. "Finish what we started. Trust Valor. He knows the way." As the words fell into the charged silence, a ripple of realization passed through the soldiers standing rigid in the morning chill. Their grief was replaced by something sharper, something that burned in the backs of their throats and lit a fire deep in their chests. Purpose. Valor, as if summoned by the authority still carried in Marcus's words, lifted his head high, his powerful frame tense and alert, his eyes gleaming with unspoken understanding. Without hesitation, he turned away from the casket and began to walk with the slow, determined steps of a soldier who knew every inch of the battlefield ahead. Captain Mercer folded the letter carefully, tucking it inside her jacket as she fell in step behind him, her shoulders squared, her mind already calculating the path forward. Around her, the once somber funeral formation transformed into a silent procession of warriors ready to fulfill their fallen commander's final order. The mission wasn't over. The war Marcus had fought in the shadows would see its end, and those responsible would answer for their sins. And leading them all, with the certainty of a soul who had never faltered, was valor. Every step a promise that the fallen would be avenged, and that justice long denied would finally come into the light. The air that once felt heavy with sorrow now crackled with a new kind of electricity, a charge that ignited the hearts of every soldier standing beneath the weeping sky. What had begun as a quiet farewell beneath the shadow of loss had become something else entirely, a rallying point, a line drawn between the regret of the past and the reckoning that waited ahead. Valor walked at the front of the procession, his powerful frame cutting through the morning fog like a living standard-bearer, his steps slow but deliberate, each paw striking the stone path with the weight of a silent drumbeat that echoed through the hollow spaces between every grave. The sharp click of his claws against the cold marble became a cadence no bugle could match, the rhythm of a mission reborn from the ashes of grief. Captain Mercer walked behind him, her spine straight despite the storm warring in her chest, her hand pressed firmly against the folded letter hidden beneath her uniform. That fragile piece of paper might as well have been a live explosive. Every word scrawled upon it, capable of dismantling lives and exposing truths long buried beneath layers of lies and betrayal. She could feel Marcus's presence in every step she took, his voice a whisper in her ear, urging her forward, reminding her that some wars don't end when the shooting stops. They end when justice is finally delivered. One by one, the soldiers who had gathered to mourn fell into step behind her, their faces grim, eyes sharp, uniforms pristine despite the cold dampness clinging to the air. These were men and women who had seen the worst humanity had to offer and stood against it anyway, and now called forth by the unlikeliest of leaders, a loyal canine soldier. They prepared to fight one final battle for the man who had never asked anything of them he wouldn't have done himself. The line of mourners moved as one down the winding cemetery path, boots striking the earth in measured unison behind Valor's unshakable lead. Families of the fallen stood to the side, their tear-streaked faces turning to watch this quiet army pass, and in their eyes shone something beyond grief. Hope, fierce and defiant. Hope that perhaps the sacrifices made beneath these stone monuments hadn't been in vain. And as the procession reached the cemetery gates, Valor paused, his head lifting toward the horizon where the gray sky began to break with the faintest glimmer of dawn, a silent signal that the darkest night was ending and the time for action had come. Without hesitation, he moved forward again, his path certain, his mission clear, and those who followed did so with hearts that burned not just with loyalty, but with the fire of unfinished justice. Captain Mercer cast one last glance over her shoulder at the field of graves behind them, her voice low but resolute, as she spoke to the wind and the memory of the man who had set all of this into motion. "We're coming, Marcus, and we won't stop until it's done." The sun melted into the horizon in a blaze of crimson and gold, painting the sky with the raw colors of sacrifice and memory as shadows stretched long across the field of stone sentinels, marking the resting places of heroes. High atop the hill overlooking that sacred ground, Valor stood motionless, his silhouette etched against the dying light like a monument forged from flesh and will. His stance as proud and unwavering as the statues that line the national memorials. His chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths, his ears perked against the hush of twilight, as if he could still hear Marcus's voice riding the winds that whispered through the graves below. Captain Mercer stood beside him, her hand resting against the thick fur of his broad shoulder, the solid weight of him grounding her, even as the enormity of what lay ahead threatened to crush the air from her lungs. Her gaze swept across the soldiers gathered at the base of the hill, their faces lit by the last embers of daylight, their eyes burning with the same fierce resolve that had carried them through countless battles. They had all bled, lost and mourned under flags just like the one folded in Mercer's hands. But now they stood ready to fight again, not for glory, not for medals, but for the honor of finishing what their fallen commander had begun. Mercer swallowed the tight knot in her throat, her voice low but unwavering, as she spoke into the hush of that moment, the words carrying farther than sound alone ever could. Lead us, Valor, one last mission. The dog's head lifted higher, his eyes locked on the path stretching beyond the horizon, his body leaning forward as if already sensing the road that destiny had laid before them. And then, with a grace that seemed almost ceremonial, Valor stepped forward, his paws silent against the earth, but each stride echoing through the hearts of those who followed. Behind him, the soldiers fell into formation without command, their boots moving in rhythm to a cause greater than any one of them, their hearts aligned with the promise whispered through the air, that duty, real duty, never dies. As they marched into the deepening dusk, the first stars began to pierce through the veil of night, glimmering like watchful eyes above. And somewhere on the edge of hearing, carried by the rising wind, came the faintest echo of Marcus Devereaux's voice, a final benediction spoken not with sorrow, but with pride. Protect, stay true, remember. And they would, because sometimes it takes the loyalty of a heart that cannot speak, and a single defiant bark to awaken the living to the battles left unfinished, to remind them that even when the last shot has been fired and the final flag folded, the fight for justice carries on in the hearts of those brave enough to answer the call. And as long as men and women stood ready to walk that path, and as long as a soldier's companion stood tall upon the hill, duty would never die.